Asked to do this conference, they actually gave me this topic. I didn't even change the name. They said, Chad, this is what we'd like you to present on. And in typical form, I said, okay, I'll take that topic and I'll present what I want to. So, no, I'm just teasing. We're going to really try to focus in on the new reality. What has this new reform order? What does it mean for the industry? So we're going to spend a little bit of time going through a quick overview of what's in the order. Also try to touch on some of the aspects in the further notice of proposed rulemaking. The order only goes so far. From that, we have this further notice of proposed rulemaking that says, well, what should we do about all these other issues? So we'll try to spend a little bit of time talking about that as well. I've put together an impacts analysis. Sorry, didn't spend the time to get your individual company, but did take 65 individual companies that we work with and put together a study that says, here's what the overall impact looks like. And then from those 65 companies, I created what I call average telephone companies. And so I'm going to show you sort of the impact of this reform order on average telephone companies. So I think that'll be sort of interesting to put some numbers to the issues. What are the financial impacts and implications? And then finally, we'll spend some time going over what are some strategies. Okay, we know now what's going to happen to us, or we have a good feel for what may happen to us. What are some strategies looking into the future? What are different things we can do to do things differently, to adapt to what the FCC is asking us to do here? How do we go forward and be successful in this new environment? And I certainly don't have any magical answer to that, but have some ideas that I'd like to share with you. And then finally, we'll end, or I'll try to save a little bit of time at the end for a question and answer session. I know this is sort of fundamental and monumental change within the industry, and so I'm sure amongst, I think there's about 400 people in the room, I'm guessing there's a question or two to be had. And I'll do my best to try to answer those questions. Certainly there are a lot more questions than there are answers at this point. So on that note, we'll get this thing kicked off. At the very beginning, there are a few slides that are not in your binder, and it's just sort of type of stuff to get things kicked off on a bit of a light note. So first, we start off with, why is the FCC looking to modify things now? We've had rate of return regulation as we know it. You know, things have changed over the years, but fundamentally, we look at access charges, inter-carrier compensation, and fundamentally that's been a very similar structure since February of 1983. So for 29 years, this has worked for us. From a USF perspective, we look back to the foundation of today's universal service funding, and that goes back to 1984, so 28 years ago. So from the FCC's perspective, you can sort of understand and say, well, you know, almost 30 years have passed since we came up with these rules. The industry has changed substantially. The technology has changed 10 times over in those 30 years. And so, you know, we've complained for a long time, really, as an industry, that the rules aren't up to date with technology. They're not reflective of how we build and operate the network and what the cost structure is today. So we sort of, in some respects, are getting what we asked for. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that we asked them to go this far, but I'll stay away from the political side and opinions and just try to stay with the facts. So in the last 28, 29 years, what are some things that have changed substantially, either within or outside of the telecommunications industry? Well, back in 83, 84 timeframe, Ronald Reagan was the president. Now, that's changed significantly since then. In 1983 or 84, camcorders and compact discs were introduced. We didn't have the CD back then. The United States invaded Grenada in 1983. HIV and AIDS, which I don't think we've quite cured yet, but we don't hear much about anymore, was discovered in that time frame. The cost of a gallon of gas was approximately $1.20. Last time I went to the pump, that's about a fourth of what I paid, so I'd love to go back then. Average price of a new car was approximately $11,000. Here's some more interesting ones related to telecommunications and the FCC. The first megabit chip was produced at Bell Labs. I don't know the size of the chips today, but I think we go up into, obviously, well past gigabits and terabits and so on. So interesting to see how that's developed. Apple Computer released the first Macintosh computer back in 1983. First cell phone was introduced by Motorola. Looks a little bit different than the cell phones we carry around today do. And the internet was still not available for commercial use. Al Gore was still working on it at that point. You laugh, but he deserves more credit than people give him. All right, so from a pictorial standpoint, let's change. Well, we had the Material Girl back in 1983, and then we had her, a week ago, singing at the Super Bowl. Interestingly, from my perspective, she looks a lot better now at 50-some years old than she did at 20-something. Hulk Hogan, maybe there's something to be said for steroid use here. He doesn't look too bad for, I think he's 58, 59 years old today. He doesn't look too bad. Although the pink is a little different than what he was wearing back then. Televisions. I know I moved recently, and my television that looks like the one on the right was a one-man job, pretty easy to move that 50-inch TV around. Well, back in the day, the 32-inch TV was a 2- to 4-man job to move around. Cell phones, as I said before, they look a little bit different. We've got Martin Cooper on the left, who is widely known as the inventor of the cell phone for Motorola. It's got that big block that we can use as a doorstop now. And then we've got the late great Steve Jobs on the right, who is holding up and introducing the iPhone. So substantial differences in that 30-year time frame. Computers. There's that first Macintosh introduced back in 1984 on the left-hand side, and then today's laptop. So a lot of things have changed from a technology standpoint, and so it probably makes some sense that the regulation of this technology, the regulation of the telecommunications network, probably needs to change a little bit as well. Again, I'm not sure that we wanted it to go down the road that it has, but we're there, so let's figure out how to deal with it. Okay, so like I said before, I'd like to spend a little bit of time, and hopefully not too much time, I'll try to move through this quickly, going over sort of the basics of the order. From a USF perspective and an inter-carrier compensation perspective, what has changed? What is the FCC doing differently? What do we need to be able to adapt to? Okay, so first we'll hit on what some of these acronyms and abbreviations mean, so when we're talking in acronyms, everyone understands. The Connect America Fund, or CAF, and Inter-Carrier Compensation, or ICC, Reform Order, and FNERM. I'll refer to that as the further notice. It's the further notice of proposed rulemaking. It was approved by the FCC on October 27, 2011, and released on November 18, 2011, which I could have guaranteed you they were going to release it on November 18th. That was, I believe, the Friday before Thanksgiving. And so, I don't know about the rest of you, but the FCC completely ruined my Thanksgiving holiday this year. I sat and read all 759 pages as the turkey was being carved in the background. And I'm going to change this a little bit. The order primarily addresses long-term inter-carrier compensation and interim USF reform. To be honest with you, I would really say it's interim USF reform and interim or partial inter-carrier compensation reform. From an inter-carrier compensation perspective, the FCC really left a lot to this further notice process of comments we're now getting ready to file and things that we're going to deal with over the next probably 4 to 6 months before they actually come up with what those rules will be. From a USF perspective, they really fundamentally changed USF as we know it today. But the big question that is yet to be answered is, from my perspective, what are we going to do about funding broadband? They really said, well, broadband is important. We have to get to this 4 megabit per second download speed by 1 megabit per second upload speed. That's the requirement. You have to get there. That's a requirement today. But the FCC's funding of that mandate has not yet come down the pipe. So we're going to wait and see what happens there. So that's what that further notice is all about, is things that the FCC hasn't yet addressed, but they know that they need to. And we'll sort of talk about the things that they have addressed things they haven't addressed or left to that further notice as we go. Okay, the CAF and ICC reform order identifies 5 primary principles. First, just like apple pie, baseball, and mom, is we got to preserve and enhance the universal availability of voice service. That's what we've always done. That's what the universal service mandate has always been, is to provide basic voice service to all comers. Anyone who wants voice throughout the country can get it, regardless of the cost to build it. The next concept, or the next principle, is the universal availability of networks capable of providing voice and broadband services. So this is the first time, from a USF perspective, that we really see the introduction of broadband into the equation. So that's sort of a new principle that they have there. Then we have the universal availability of networks capable of providing mobile voice and broadband services. Now, historically, mobile carriers have been able to get access to universal service funding through the identical support rule that we've had in place. As a competitive provider, they can come in and get the same amount of support that you receive on a per-line basis. Well, that's going away, and they're setting aside separate funds to deploy 3G and 4G wireless services throughout the country where it doesn't exist today. So that's sort of a new concept as well, is the mobility side being explicitly supported. The next principle is to ensure that rates for voice and broadband are reasonably comparable across the U.S. It's the same as we have today. We have a requirement from a voice perspective that rates be reasonably comparable across the country. However, we now bring into the equation broadband again. And then finally, and interestingly, they talk about minimizing the USF burden on consumers. Today, end users pay, I can never remember the exact number, but somewhere in the ballpark of 16 to 17% of their interstate end user revenues, money they pay us for interstate services, goes into the Universal Service Fund. So obviously that's a pretty big chunk of that bill that they pay. And so the FCC wants to reduce or to minimize that. Interestingly, on the other side of the coin, they're saying, we need to continue to support voice services. We need to add broadband. We need to add mobile services. And oh, by the way, we'll find out that we're also going to shift some inter-carrier compensation cost recovery from long-distance companies, basically, over to the Universal Service Fund. So I'm a little hazy as to how we're going to minimize that burden on end-user customers. We're going to shift all of that cost recovery into Universal Service funding. But, I'm optimistic that we can make it work. Okay, those were the 4 or 5 goals. Now we move to 4 different principles that they have behind it. First, the order is designed to modernize universal service funding and inter-carrier compensation to include broadband. We now provide broadband networks, not just a voice network. And so how do we shift that cost recovery to reflect that? The second principle is fiscal responsibility. I feel that they need to control the size of the fund. As it exists today, in most cases, we incur whatever costs we deem are appropriate to provide those services to our customers. And there's a cost recovery mechanism there to allow us to recover those costs. So in this order, we'll see a lot of the FCC trying to limit what our costs are, how much we invest in plant, what our operating expenditures are, how much we pay for corporate operations expense. And that sort of encompasses everyone in this room, the general managers, the board of directors, shoot us consultants included. So there's a lot in this order about fiscal responsibility and controlling those costs that we incur in providing service. Accountability, both for the recipients of funding, so continued auditing of the costs that we're reporting for cost recovery and the funds that we're receiving, and then also government administrators, looking at NECA, looking at USAC, making sure that they're being the proper stewards of that support that they're designed to be. And then finally, an interesting one that we've not really felt or seen before as rural rate of return carriers are these incentive-based policies. They want to make sure that they're providing some incentive for reducing our costs. So that incentive comes in the form of, hopefully, some greater cost recovery in some areas. So again, we'll talk about that as we move forward. Okay, so we talked about there needing to be some constraints on the size of the fund. So what is the budget? Well, it's a $4.5 billion budget, which is approximately the size of the Universal Service Fund today. That includes approximately $1.8 billion of price cap carriers, $500 million a year in mobility funding, $100 million for what's called a remote areas fund, and then approximately $2 billion for rate of return carriers. Primarily that's us in this room. And again, that's about the amount of support that we're receiving today, approximately $2 billion. And that includes the support we receive today in the form of high-cost loop support, interstate common line support, safety net additive, safety valve support, and then we have a new fund that's being built, created, called Inter-Carrier Compensation Connect America Fund. So again, I apologize for all these acronyms, but if I didn't abbreviate, we'd never fit it into 2 hours or onto a small number of slides. Now, funding in any given year could be more or less than this $4.5 billion because they'll look and say, okay, how much have we collected last year? How much do we need this year? Well, it's going to be $4.5 billion or something shy of that. So the funding that they pay out may actually be less than the $4.5 billion, but they're going to collect $4.5 billion each year. And so in essence, what they're able to do, which they haven't done in the past, is to create a slush fund. So it'll be interesting to see what that slush fund ends up being. I don't envision that it's going to be real significant, but it allows for that, for USAC to hold on to some funds for future needs. Okay, so now let's get into the actual components of the reform. We'll talk about USF first, and then we'll shift over to inter-carrier compensation, and then we'll move on from there. Okay, so from a USF reform perspective, we continue to have similar voice service requirements to what we have today. One limited exception to that is that voice must be offered as a standalone service. We can't require that customers buy it in a bundle with broadband or other services. You have to have an offering that's just standalone local voice service. We have some broadband service requirements. First, that those rates have to be comparable to what's available in urban markets. And that's from a retail perspective. So that's sort of interesting from a rural ILAC perspective. Typically, we don't provide, as the regulated rural rate of return carrier, we typically don't provide retail broadband service. We provide broadband transport as a wholesale service to either an affiliate or an unaffiliated ISP, who then provides the retail service to end user customers. However, there is a requirement that those rates be reasonably comparable to rates provided in urban areas. I've already mentioned this next one. We have a 4 megabit per second download by 1 megabit per second upload speed requirement. Now that's not saying that every customer has to buy or has to be given 4x1. It means that you have to make it available to them if they want it. So your rate list can include a wide variety of different services and speeds, but one of them at least has to be above 4x1 or at or above 4x1. So you can offer whatever speeds you want to, and customers can take whatever they want to. But if a customer comes in and says, hey, I want 4x1 broadband, you have to be able to provide it to them upon reasonable request. You know, if it's going to cost you a couple $100,000 to build it, likely to be being done reasonable, and we would probably pass them off to someone under this remote areas fund or a satellite provider that can maybe do that on a more cost-effective basis. We have some requirements around latency. Time it takes for a data packet to get from one end to the other has to be sufficiently low to enable real viable commercial application over this broadband network. And for voice over IP to work properly, there has to be very small amounts of delay. Okay, so now from a rate of return perspective, and the order really addresses rate of return carriers, it also addresses price cap carriers. Well, I took a leap of faith and assumed that there weren't any or many price cap carriers going to be in this room, so we're not going to talk about the price cap side of the reform. If you're interested in that, I've got a completely separate presentation for you another day with that. So, from a rate of return perspective, what does the order do to our universal service funding support? First is it implements some limitations on capital and operating expenses. These limitations are to be implemented no later than July 1st of 2012. There's no definitive answer as to how those limitations are going to be calculated today. In the order, the FCC provided an appendix that said, here's how we think we might do it. Here's a regression analysis that we've calculated on all 723 cost company study areas throughout the country. And we've calculated how much we think we would like to limit their capital expenditures and operating expenses. So they published that as part of the order, and then they made available the individual company data behind it. So for every company out there, we're able to see how much capital expenditure they're saying you should have. And well, maybe not should have, but the cap on the amount that you can have. And same for operating expenses. Now, if your actual costs are lower, you don't get the higher number. But if your actual costs are higher than their calculated limitation, then you'll get that lower number. And so that regression analysis was outlined in that order, or actually in that appendix to the order. It's a much maligned analysis. I won't go much further than that because I've got a lot of opinions about it, but I was asked not to give too many opinions today. So it's a much maligned analysis. We think that it'll be fundamentally changed by the time it all is said and done, but we don't know yet. That is the subject of comments that a bunch of people filed here back in January. And the FCC is now sort of mulling over, well, what are we going to do in response to those comments? How, if any, are we going to change that regression analysis that we performed? So they did this comparison of cost to similarly situated companies and said, here's the maximum amount of capital expenditure and operating expenses you can have. Now, from a capital expenditure standpoint, the tough part about this is there's a retroactive application. These are dollars you've already spent. The regression analysis doesn't say, oh, and here's how much incremental dollars you can spend in the future. It says, in total, here's how much cost you can report for cost recovery going forward. So if you've already spent those dollars on that plant, unfortunately you can't unbuild it, but they're going to stop paying for it. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Once they come to some conclusion as to how that regression analysis is going to work, they'll update it on an annual basis, compare costs again nationwide, and come up with, again, a company-specific limitation for the following year. So every year going forward, we'll have something come out of the FCC that says, from a cost recovery perspective, here's how much cost you can include in your calculations. And initially that is focused on high-cost loop support. However, in the further notice of proposed rulemaking, the FCC does ask, and how do we apply similar limitations to interstate common line support? A lot of companies out there get a significant amount of high-cost loop support, but there are some that don't receive any high-cost loop support. So amongst this room, there may be some of you wiping your brow and saying, okay, we got lucky there. However, from an interstate common line support, there's no one that's going to get away from that. We all get interstate common line support. There may be a few limited exceptions to that, but it's pretty rare. Most companies receive a significant amount of interstate common line support. So if you get capped or limited, there is going to be an impact on you. Okay. The corporate operations expense limitation It's something that we've dealt with for a long time. From a high-cost loop support perspective, they've said over time, this is the amount of corporate operations expense that you can include in that calculation. Anything above that is excluded from support. Well, they're going to carry that forward to interstate common line support in the future. So the limitation we have today was set aside for high-cost loop support. Now they're going to bring it across to interstate common line support as well. They've also made some minor updates to that calculation. Sort of a complex calculation. I won't walk through it. I won't test you later on what these calculations are and what the results are for your particular company. But just understand that this formula has changed a little bit, and it's been sort of re-benchmarked or rebased. In the past, they set this formula, I can't remember the timing of when they set these latest calculations, but then every year they would use a gross domestic product chain price index, sort of an inflation factor, to bulk that up by about 2 to 3% per year. So they'll continue doing that, but they've rebased it and recalculated the support amount. In terms of what does this actually mean for companies, first, from a high-cost loop support perspective, the crossover point is about 3,500 access lines. Companies with 3,500 access lines or less will get a little bit more of their corporate operations expense included in that calculation. Companies with more than 3,500 access lines will get a little bit less of their corporate operations expense included in the calculation than we historically have. Not real significant differences, but a little bit here and there. But the big impact, again, is from an interstate common line support perspective. If you're above that corporate operations expense limitation, well, you've sort of always been there for high-cost loop support. So any changes there are pretty small, pretty incremental. But from an ICLS perspective, you've never been capped there, so that could hit pretty hard, effective a month ago. 6 weeks ago, I guess, I'm losing track. 2012 is flying by fast. So some important things there in terms of impacts on existing support. We're going to reduce high-cost loop support for carriers with artificially low local rates. What does artificially low mean? Well, they set this 3-step benchmark of artificially low local rates. And that starts at $10 at July 1st, 2012, goes to $14 at July 1st, 2013, and then goes to the nationwide average starting July 1st of 2014. So 10, 14, and then the latest measurement they have of the nationwide average is, as of 2008, that was $15.62. So if your local rates are below that, then either you have to raise your local rate to this benchmark, or you'll forego on a dollar-for-dollar basis high-cost loop support. The basic premise being is the customer has to pay a base amount before federal universal service funding is willing to chip in for it. So if the customer is not paying that base amount, the company has to basically impute that revenue into their revenue streams before high-cost loop support kicks in. And a new requirement here is that we'll have to annually submit rates and fees to USAC so that they can calculate what this rate floor is for 2014 and beyond, so they can calculate that nationwide average. Now, there are a few companies out there that are going to wipe their brow and say, okay, I got lucky here, because there are some companies that don't receive high-cost loop support. Well, the order specifically says if you're below that local rate, if you have artificially low local rates, then you'll forego high-cost loop support. If I don't have high-cost loop support, I have nothing to forego. I'm not terribly worried about it. Okay, safety net additive is a support that some companies have received over the years, not many. It's been a growing number. And basically what they've said is that if your gross plant and service increases by 14% per year on a per-line basis, then you're eligible for some additional high-cost loop support. Well, over the last few years, what's happened is costs have continued to climb, but maybe not at 14%. But the other side of that equation is loops or access lines, they're on the decline. So as we lose access lines, our investment on a per line basis is growing, in many cases 14% or more. So that's resulted in a lot of companies becoming eligible for support that really wasn't intended for them. It was really designed for new significant investment. And so the FCC has sort of grandfathered that and said, all right, if you qualified legitimately as a result of investment in plant, we're going to allow you to continue getting support for the period that you're currently eligible for. So they actually go back to 2009 and say if you legitimately qualified in 2009 or earlier, we'll carry that support out to its end, or a 5-year period. However, if you qualified for support as a result of a loss of access lines, well, that wasn't what was intended. We're going to phase your support out over 2 years. So in 2012, you get half of the calculated support for 2012, and in 2013, that would go to 0. Not sure how exactly that's a 2-year phase out. To me, it's a 1 year, you get 50%, and then you get nothing. But they define it as a 2-year phase out, so that's what we'll go with. Okay, LSS, local switching support, has been eliminated as a separate support mechanism. Again, everyone in this room gets local switching support. Don't go jump off the bridge yet. It's a lot of money, but it's being eliminated from universal service funding, and it's being shifted into what's called eligible recovery for inter-carrier compensation reform. And I'll talk about that here in a little bit. So just know that you're going to lose a fair amount from explicit local switching support, but it goes elsewhere for cost recovery. And some details about how that's implemented. We'll get local switching support through July 1st or June 30th of 2012, and at that point it shifts over to inter-carrier compensation. Okay, they've adjusted the high-cost loop support cap. Historically, we've had a cap or a limitation on the total amount of support available via high-cost loop support. That's been about $900 million the past few years. And so they're adjusting that high-cost loop support cap down to about $800 million because they're taking certain rate of return companies that are affiliated with price cap carriers, and they're taking them out of the high-cost loop support fund. So everyone else in that fund isn't losing support. They're just taking the total size of the fund, shifting $100 million out with those price cap carriers that they're taking out of the fund. So it's no big deal there. Just know that if you've heard of a $900 million fund in the past, and now you hear someone talk about an $800 million fund, well, that's why it declined, or primarily why it declined by $100 million. Okay. There's a total cap on universal service funding that's being implemented of $3,000 per line per year. Actually, in the order, they really address it as $250 per line per month. Very few companies nationwide that actually receive more than $3,000 per month in support. So probably not a significant impact on most of you in here. However, there are some very high-cost companies out there that serve very remote areas that get a lot more than $3,000 per year in support. So for those handful of companies impacted, it's a big hit. It's not just an incremental change. It's a sort of monumental sea change, if you will. It's effective July 1st, 2012. It applies to eligible telecommunications carriers, so rural ILECs like yourself, as well as competitive eligible telecommunications carriers. Those are the competitors who get identical support based on the amount that we're receiving on a per line basis. It does apply to all high-cost support, so that's high-cost loop support, local switching support, interstate common line support, that safety net additive, and so on. However, here in a little while, we'll talk about ICC CAF, that new universal service funding associated with inter-carrier compensation. That doesn't go into this equation. So if I'm above that $250 per line per month cap, in the first year of that phase out of support, I'll receive $250 per line plus 2/3 of the difference between $250 and my actual cost-based support. In that second year, I'll get $250 plus 1/3 of the difference. And then in the third year of that transition, I'll only get the $250 per line of support. And this is one where they've specifically stated, and actually throughout the order they talk about the availability of a waiver process, but this is one where they point specifically to the fact that you can file for a waiver or an adjustment. However, it's very important to understand that there's strong language in the rules and in the order that says there's a very heavy burden, a high bar to jump over, if you will, in order to prove that you require more than the $250 per line per month in support. So don't take the fact that there's a waiver process as a guarantee of, oh, well, we just filed for a waiver, we'll continue getting the support we receive today. They're going to look at a lot of different things, including your non-regulated operations. They want to know on a total company basis how much cost recovery you're getting and how much they think you really need. So you're going to have to open things up to the FCC in order to get this waiver, to apply for a waiver that you've never given them before. So it could be an interesting process. And they specifically say that they don't envision routinely granting these waivers. So it could be pretty difficult. In the order, they talk about eliminating support where there is an unsubsidized competitor with 100% overlap of your study area. Again, a situation that we don't see a lot of companies in that case. Really, it has to do with where there's a cable TV provider that's providing both voice and broadband across 100% of your study area. Very few situations where a competitor has that amount of overlap, especially in a lot of the very remote areas that you serve, and satellite doesn't count. So it can't be DirecTV or Dish Network. They say it actually has to be fixed terrestrial service. So I won't get into the details of what that means besides not satellite. So in most cases, we're pretty safe. In the order, they actually show a table that says that nationwide they've identified, I think it's 18 study areas where they believe that there's 99% or more overlap. So, maybe a handful of companies in this room that could potentially be impacted by that. But if you are impacted, it's a heavy hit. Where you have unsubsidized competition with that significant overlap, they're going to take away 100% of the support that you receive today. That will likely be a crushing, potentially a death blow for those supported carriers. In the further notice, they do talk about, well, we've specifically identified in the order that if we have 100% overlap, we're going to take 100% of your support. But if there's some level below 100%, maybe 85% is a level they identify, is at 85%, should we be taking away some amount of support as well? So even if you're not 100% overlap, there's still risk in this further notice process that if you're 75% overbuilt basically by a competitor, that you could lose some level of support as well. And sure. And I'll try to keep most of the questions till the end if possible, but it's a good question. And the question is how do you determine whether you truly are overlapped, to simplify the question? And unfortunately, there's not a definitive answer. What the FCC is looking at today is the maps that, and of course I'm going to forget, I think it's NTCA has put together that says here's the broadband map across the country, here's where service is available and where it isn't. And so, as of now, they're using those NTCA maps to look and see, okay, where is the broadband coverage by alternative providers? And again, they say it has to be fixed and terrestrial. So I'm not a technical guy, but I know that means that satellite doesn't count. I think a wireless ISP would count because it's a fixed service and that is considered terrestrial. So I hope that answers your question to some extent, but it's not well defined at this point. There are a lot of components in the order where the FCC basically says, and we leave authority to the Wireline Competition Bureau or the Wireless Bureau to address this, or to write the rules, or to interpret what the order says. So there are a lot of areas that are pretty ambiguous that we're going to have to get some answers to those questions over time. Okay, I already talked about the waiver process to seek relief from those USF reforms. Not going to grant those routinely, subject to that total company earnings review. When we look at average telephone company here in a little while, I think we'll find that the FCC may be a little bit surprised by what the non-regulated operations really look like. I think the assumption within the regulatory community is that non-regulated operations are just a big boondoggle. You're just raking the cash in hand over fist, and that you ought to use some of that cash now to support the regulated operations. And I think you all know that in many cases that's just not true. And when we look at average telephone company here in just a little while, the numbers sort of bear that out as well. Okay, accountability and oversight. We've got some more reporting requirements. Of course, with regulation, even with regulation we may not like, comes more reporting requirements. We've got to share more information with the FCC and other regulators. So, beginning April 1st of 2012, and actually just last week, late last week, we got some clarification from the FCC that some of these reporting requirements really aren't going to kick into gear April 1st of 2012, just because there's no way for carriers like yourselves to get ready to ramp up and actually make those filings this year. So the reporting requirements are, well, first I'll step back up to the fact that today, most eligible telecommunications carriers, that's just your eligibility to receive universal service funding, that is basically certified every year, and typically by the State Public Utilities Commission. You go through a certification process with your state PUC, and that process varies from state to state. Some is just a letter saying I self-certify this. In other states, you have to provide a lot of information about how you're actually spending those USF dollars. Well, there are some states that say, hey, we're not going to control that process. You need to be certified as an ETC. You've got to go to the FCC. So there are some companies today that go to the FCC for that annual certification. They have some fairly onerous requirements. Well, but it's only been to those handful of companies currently certified by the FCC. Well, going forward, all companies have to certify to the FCC. The state is being taken out of that equation. And so April 1st of each year going forward, everybody's going to have to report to the FCC based on the FCC's typically more onerous requirements. The reporting requirements that are sort of new are speed and latency. So annual performance results of tests that say this is the upload and download speeds that our network is capable of, and latency. How long does it take to get a packet from one point to another on our network? Any capacity requirements that we set on end user customers. Hey, for this fixed rate, you get 100 megabits or megabytes of download or upload. Any capacity requirements that we set on customers, we're going to have to certify on an annual basis that that's comparable to similar capacity requirements in urban areas. And then from a build-out and service quality perspective, we're going to have to file with the FCC a 5-year build-out plan and basically explain to them how are we going to get to these broadband requirements over the next 5 years. Where are we going to spend the universal service funds that we receive to meet these requirements? So that's due April 1st, thank goodness, of 2013, and then each year going forward. have to self-certify that you're taking reasonable steps to offer broadband at the requirements, 4 by 1 megabit per second, up and download speeds. And from a pricing standpoint, you're going to have to self-certify that your voice service is provided at no more than 2 standard deviations above the national average. That's a problem for some companies today that, because the state PUC requirements have local rates that are pretty high. 2 standard deviations above the national average. The national average, we're at 1562 as it was in 2008. 2 standard deviations would probably put you in the $18 to $20 range. And so likely, and that's on residential service. So likely there are some companies that have rates that are a bit higher than that. And then you're going to annually have to submit to the FCC and others your pricing information for both voice and broadband services on an annual basis, so they can calculate those national averages and tell you what you have to charge the next year. So in an environment where you probably haven't changed your local rates much over the years, you may want to get used to the fact that in order to be eligible for universal service funding, not to forego some revenues, you're quite likely going to have to change your rates from time to time, maybe even as often as annually, in order to keep up with the regulation and the amount of support that is eligible to you. Privately held rate of return carriers must submit audited financial statements on an annual basis. Not a big issue for most companies. They're audited today. However, companies that are not audited today will have to start performing those audits and file those with the FCC. That's a big issue for some companies, because to find out in basically December of 2011 that your financials need to be audited in 2012, that's pretty onerous. And so a lot of folks have really pushed back on that one. We firmly believe that the FCC is going to either push that reporting date back from April 1st, 2012, hopefully at least as much as a couple of months. And I think the goal in the industry is to push that back to 2013 at the earliest, and then change it from an April 1st deadline to a May or June 1st to allow everyone to get those audits completed in a reasonable time period. Also, annual ownership information is required. What's the holding company, operating company, affiliates, DBAs, and so on. Okay, so that's a quick rundown of the USF components of the reform. I do want to keep moving. I don't want to get too far behind schedule here, so that we can get through all of this and leave a little bit of time for questions, hopefully. So, inter-carrier compensation reform, some underlying principles here is first is the FCC would like to phase out per minute of use inter-carrier compensation charges. Really from the perspective of the fact that we're seeing a lot of minutes go away. Those full minutes of use are now being shifted over to voice over IP, or to email, or to some other form than a per minute of use function. So the minutes of use that we've historically seen and the revenues associated with those minutes of use have been on the decline for years now. And so one of the goals is to find some other way of recovering those costs, because we're seeing revenue streams decline and sort of reliance on universal service funding increase. They'd like to migrate to what they call bill and keep, which is an interesting way of saying don't bill anyone anything, but keep, well, I shouldn't say don't bill anyone anything. Don't bill other carriers anything. Bill your end user customers for your costs. You keep the revenues that you generate from your end user customers. From an inter-carrier compensation perspective, they should just call it zero. They want to promote the transition to IP networks. So again, getting away from per minute of use cost recovery. There's the presumption that that will drive the network decisions to more of an IP technology. This is one actually that I actually do really like, is the providing a more predictable path for the industry and investors. Like I said before, minutes of use are on the decline. Revenues associated with those minutes are also on the decline. So looking forward, we don't know exactly where our revenues are coming from in the future. As those minutes dry up, so do our revenues. So what this does is establishes some more predictable cost recovery. Not saying it's going to increase. We'll actually see that that cost recovery is going to steadily decline over time, but it is predictable. We can calculate what cost recovery will be in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road using the formulas that the FCC has outlined. And then finally, they'd like to eliminate the hidden subsidies in the current system. Still charging inter-exchange carriers for costs that are really driven by end-user customers who demand the services provided by those inter-exchange carriers or other content providers. So shifting that subsidy or shifting that cost recovery over to who the FCC deems to be the cost causer as the end-user customer. Okay. So this is sort of a complex process of transitioning to bill and keep. So the first step in that process is the FCC has said we're going to take all interstate switched access rates and we're going to cap them at their current level. So that was effective back in December of 2011. So okay, you can't change these rates, or you can't increase them. You can certainly decrease them if you wanted to. That's for originating and terminating switched access services. Some detail here about what those services are, but I won't bore you with the details. From an intrastate perspective, it also caps intrastate terminating rates only, because the FCC has deemed that as of today, their authority only applies to terminating or termination of services from an intrastate standpoint. So they capped everything on the interstate side. From an intrastate standpoint, it's only terminating. That also includes reciprocal compensation. Reciprocal compensation is primarily what we charge and are charged by wireless carriers for passing traffic back and forth with each other. So, and we do have some situations where intrastate rates are already lower than those interstate rates, and the order does not allow you to raise intrastate rates up to the interstate level. We'll actually see over time that we have a transition from intrastate rates down to interstate rates, and then eventually down to zero over time. Okay, so it's a 9-step process, or 9 years to get from the current rate structure and rate levels that we have down to that bill and keep environment, or zero. So at July 1st of 2012, the first thing we've got to do is, if our intrastate switched access rates are higher than our interstate rates, we have to take those intrastate rates halfway down to the interstate rates. So as of July 1st, most companies should see a reduction in their intrastate switched access rates for terminating traffic only. And then at July 1st of 2013, we're going to set our intrastate rates at parity with our interstate rates, except those limited exceptions where intrastate rates are already lower than the interstate rates. So, 2-step process over 2 years, we're going to get down to parity across the board. All switched access rates will be at their current interstate levels. Okay, and third step in the process, actually the third through fifth steps in the process, are a sort of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 transition from current interstate rates down to half a penny a minute. So in 2014, we'll take 1/3 of the difference between the current interstate rate and that half a penny a minute. July 1st of 2015, we'll take 2/3 of that difference. And then finally, July 1st, 2016, those rates will be set at half a penny a minute. Slowly getting there. Sort of death by 1,000 paper cuts, if you will. The next 3 years, or 3 steps in the process, take us from half a penny a minute down to 0007. So 0.0007 cents per minute of use. And so again, we go 1/3 of the way in 2017, 2/3 of the way in 2018, and then at July 1st, 2019, those interstate switched access rates are set at 0.0007. Then the final step in the process is July 1st of 2019. We take all of those rates and we basically pull them out of our interstate and intrastate tariffs because they are now effectively zero. So at that point in time, and again, this only addresses terminating rates. Originating rates are left to that further notice of proposed rulemaking, and we'll see what the FCC decides to do there. In the further notice, they say, hey, bill and keep is the end game for originating access as well, but they're sort of studying their ability to do that, how they're going to approach it. My personal opinion is it's going to follow the same path. It's just going to start down that path maybe a year later than we're going to from a terminating perspective. Okay. Some other issues that are addressed in the order relative to inter-carrier compensation. We've got interconnection agreements in place, typically with wireless carriers, but some CLECs as well, that talk about how we interexchange traffic back and forth and what we pay each other for passing that traffic back and forth. And those interconnection agreements are not typically set at our switched access rate. We have a different rate for reciprocal compensation. Well, those rates have to migrate to bill and keep as well. And actually for wireless carriers, we have to go to bill and keep effective July 1st of 2012. So it's a pretty quick transition for local reciprocal compensation. And so what the FCC has said is, hey, these rules don't circumvent any interconnection agreements that you have in place. You should have a clause in that interconnection agreement that talks about renegotiation or a change of law or something along those lines. So those clauses would be enacted by this change or this reform, and you would work with those wireless carriers to modify those rates. Now, in most cases, you're sort of the net recipient of reciprocal compensation revenues, so I'm not sure that I would be jumping up and down and running to the wireless carriers and asking them to go to bill and keep, but they will be coming to you here shortly to take care of that. Some other things, as I mentioned, originating is left to that further notice. Transport rates are left to that further notice as well, and then even some other rate elements left to sort of future discussion. Okay, so let me step back. This has really been talking about reducing our revenue streams, going from 3 cents per minute or whatever we're billing today for that switched access on a per minute use basis, and bringing that down to zero over time. That's a substantial amount of revenue for most companies that we're talking about today. So that's a lot of cost recovery. And so then the question running through your mind is, okay, if they're taken away on one side, where are they giving it back to me? Because I can't survive without those revenue streams. I have to have that cost recovery. Well, there is what they call eligible recovery that takes that into account. It gives you the cost recovery for the costs that you've legitimately incurred. And so in the order they call that eligible recovery. Eligible recovery is sort of a complex calculation. I've tried to boil it down to some simple concepts here. So we have what's called a rate of return baseline, which is made up of 3 different things. It's our 2011 interstate switched access revenue requirement, as reported to NECA in February of 2011 for the 2011 NECA tariff filing. A little bit of complexity there because what NECA uses for the 2011 tariff filing is half a year of forecasted 2011 costs and half a year of forecasted 2012 costs. So that 2011 interstate switched access revenue requirement is actually half a year of 2011, half a year of 2012 as forecasted back in February of 2011. Sorry, I know it gets a little confusing. 2011 intrastate switched access revenues billed from October 1st, 2010 through September 30th of 2011. So they went with a fiscal year instead of a calendar year. And collected by March 31st of 2012. So if you billed those revenues but you haven't collected them, you don't get to include them in your eligible cost recovery going forward. Then the third element is 2011 net reciprocal compensation. Again, those are the charges you're assessing to wireless carriers and other CLECs to pass traffic back and forth. Typically, when you net that revenue and that expense out, rural carriers tend to have a net revenue as opposed to a net expense. So you'll take that 2011 net revenue for reciprocal compensation as well. And again, that is from October of 2010 through September of 2011, billed and collected by March 31st of 2012. And then one other thing comes into play, what I always refer to as a productivity factor. They then take that baseline from 2011 and reduce it 5% per year going forward. So for 2012, your eligible recovery is 2011 times 95%. For 2013, your eligible recovery is 2012 times 95%, and so on. So in that fashion, you'll never get to zero. They're not taking 5% off of the baseline each year. They're taking 5% off of the prior year. So that eligible recovery comes from three different sources. The first is inter-carrier compensation revenues. Although we're transitioning those rates down to zero or to bill and keep, we're still going to be charging those carriers something. So that builds into those revenues. We have something called the access recovery charge that I'll get to here in a minute. But think about it as an increased subscriber line charge for end user customers. That's $6.50 or $9.20 that your end user customers pay today. We're going to be adding to that. And then finally, the Connect America Fund. What doesn't come from those other sources, we're going to get from Universal Service Funding. Okay, so the access recovery charge is sort of a complicated beast. I'll try to boil it down to about a minute discussion here if I can. For residential and single line business customers, it's a 50-cent charge starting July 1st, 2012, and it increases by 50 cents per year. So in July 1st, 2012 through June 30th, 2013, I'll charge residential and single line business customers 50 cents per line per month. At July 1st, 2013, that'll go to $1 per line per month. The following July, it'll go to $1.50. So over 6 years, it's going to become an incremental $3 charge on the bill. For multi-line business customers, it's $1 per year for up to 6 years, but in reality, because of some details in the rules, it'll only go for 3 years for the vast majority of companies. So multi-line business customers will end up with a $3 access recovery charge on their bill as well, but it'll build to that $3 over 3 years, as opposed to residential and single line business, where it goes to $3 over 6 years. Now, there is a big caveat here. Again, we look at a local rate benchmark. To the extent that your local rate, plus your federal subscriber line charge, plus mandatory PAS charges, plus certain surcharges, which usually aren't significant, plus this access recovery charge, if all of those add up to $30 or more, then you don't have to assess the ARC, or you can stop growing the ARC. So if at some point in this transition process you hit $30, you stop charging. But, there's always a but, that's only for residential customers. For all business customers, you have to assess it, or you impute the revenue in the calculation of how much Connect America funding you receive. So for all of your business customers, realize that over the next 3 to 6 years, they're going to incur a $3 increase on their bill. Residential customers, it just depends on this whole calculation here. So then, how do we calculate how much Connect America fund support we receive? Well, we start with that eligible recovery, and from that, we're going to subtract the inter-carrier compensation revenues that we bill to inter-exchange carriers. We're also going to subtract the access recovery charge revenues that we charge to our end user customers. What's left over, the residual at the bottom, is the amount of Connect America Fund support that we receive. But remember that that top line eligible recovery reduces by 5% per year. So presumably our Connect America Fund support is going to decline over time because of two reasons. The eligible recovery is declining by 5%, and the access recovery charges are increasing each year for up to 6 years. And so the amount of CAF support that we're likely to receive is probably going to decrease over time. The other part of that equation is how quickly are our intercarrier compensation revenues declining due to that phase down to the peak. Okay, so some monitoring or some compliance requirements as a result of this intercarrier compensation reform. Have to file the following information on an annual basis. Our intercarrier compensation rates, both state and interstate, for the first couple years, and then once they're at parity, it's just one rate across the board. Intercarrier compensation revenues, expenses, and then demand, minutes of use for the preceding year. Waiver requirements, similar to our universal service funding side of the equation. We do have the ability to file for a waiver if we believe that this reform is going to have substantial negative impact on the financial performance of the company. However, pretty high bar established, total cost and earnings review for both regulated and non-regulated operations. So, you know, going to have to sort of open the books up and show the FCC everything. Again, not so sure that that's such a bad thing from the perspective of we may be able to dispel the myth that our non-regulated operations are cash cows. Okay, so I told you earlier about example telephone company, average telephone company. So I want to walk through real quick some of the impacts as we've seen them on this 65 company sample that we put together of at least some of our clients and what we've come up with in terms of the impact. I think some of them may be a little bit surprising. You know, we'll talk a little bit about some of the unique things that we're seeing. So here's how we come up with average telephone company. We started with 65 plus company study areas. Those study areas encompass about 309,000 access lines, estimated for 2012. You average that out to about 4,800 access lines per company. These 65 companies have approximately $200 million in estimated 2012 universal service funding, about $75 million of interstate switched access revenue requirement, $35 million in intrastate switched access revenues, and approximately $900 million worth of rate base or net investment in plant in their network that still needs to be recovered from these cost recovery mechanisms. So that's how we created average telephone company. Is we started with those 65 companies and we divided everything by 65 and said, okay, this is approximately what an average company should look like. Pretty simplified analysis, I know. There's probably more complex ways of doing it, but we went with simple. So when we look at it from a USF perspective, we went and looked at each of the individual components of that USF order and a couple of items in the further notice as well, just to try to get a feel for the overall impacts. We looked at the $3,000 total USF cap, or that $250 per month limitation. We looked at the phase down of safety net additive if it was caused by a reduction in lose. We looked at the capping of corporate operations expense. We looked at the capping of corporate operations expense from high-cost loop as well as interstate common line support, artificially low local rates, capital and operating caps or limitations. That's that regression analysis I talked about earlier. And the implementation date for each of those items is either January 1st of 2012 or July 1st of 2012. So some of these items have a full year impact in 2012, others have only half a year. But then we look at 2013 and 2014, and each of them has a full year implication. So the $3,000 total USF cap, again, as I mentioned earlier, if you're one of those companies that are hit, in that sample of 65 companies, I believe that there were 2 that hit that $3,000 a year cap. It is huge. It's a really, really big impact on their overall revenue streams. But when we average that out among 65 companies, it comes out to be a fairly small annual impact. We look at the phase down or the elimination of safety net additive. That's as a result of loss of access lines. And that actually becomes a pretty big one. We've seen a lot more companies over the past few years become eligible for safety net additive support, or an increased amount of support than we historically had as a result of those loss of access lines. So this one was actually a bit surprising to me until we ran the numbers that it was such a big impact. You know, $18,000 in year 1, ratcheting up to over $30,000 a year on average for 2013 and 14. The high cost loop support corporate operations expense cap. This is primarily the result of the fact that some of those larger companies, over 3,500 access lines, that are either right below the cap today or above the cap, are going to be hit a little bit harder going forward. So we see some additional reductions there. Interstate common line support. Remember, this is the one where that cap hadn't previously been applied to the calculation of ICLS. Well, it is now. So every company that was above that corporate operations expense cap is now being hit on ICLS as well as high cost loop support. So some pretty big numbers there, over $40,000 a year. We then go to artificially low local rates. When we talk about a $10 local rate, we don't see many companies that are below that threshold. So pretty small there. We then jump to $14 in 2013. Start to see more companies with local rates below that $14 level. And then finally in 2014, we used as a surrogate that $15.62 per month number. And again, start seeing more and more companies that are below that artificially low local rate, that unless you increase those rates, our assumption here was that average telephone company did not, they would forego, in 2014, that $20,000 of high cost loop support. We then look at the regression-based limitations on capital and operating expenditures. And we didn't change anything in the FCC's analysis, even though we think that there are some problems with it. We sort of ran those numbers through our analysis and came up with some pretty significant impacts. Now, I won't go into all of the details of this regression analysis because I put everyone to sleep. But it was designed, or our understanding was, it was designed to basically cap the top 10 highest, or top 10% of the highest cost companies. So they looked at it and said, hey, if you're at or below the 90th percentile, then we're going to leave your costs alone. If you're above that 90th percentile, we're going to limit your costs at that 90th percentile. So, sort of logic says that's going to cap 10% of people, or 10% of companies. But they looked at 11 different factors and said, we're going to cap individual factors. So if you're above the 90th percentile for any one of those 11 factors, well, then your cost recovery is capped for that individual item. So what ends up happening is that not 10% of companies get hit by this regression-based cap. It's actually over 40% of companies get hit by that regression-based cap. And so just a lot of unique things there. Why you don't see an impact, even though it says implementation date July 1st, 2012 for high-cost loop support. This is an interpretation we've made. We're all seeking clarification on what the right approach is. In the order, it says that these caps are effective July 1st of 2012. Well, we don't know if that means that it's for support that's being paid in 2012. That high-cost loop support, 2012 payments are based on 2010 costs, or is it basically for costs that are reported after July 1st of 2012. That's how we've interpreted it. But who knows, hard to say for sure. From an ICLS perspective, that's based on a forecast, so the cost recovery you get in 2012 is based on actual 2012 costs. So we firmly believe that that actually will take place July 1st, 2012. So again, as you can see for average telephone company, USF impacts, USF reform will likely reduce their universal service funding by over $100,000 in 2012. Pretty big number. You then look forward to 2013, and that jumps up to about $260,000. And then, just because some costs are ratcheting down over time, we see 2014 at about $240,000. Here in just a couple minutes, we'll look at average telephone companies' net income and do some analysis on what these reductions in revenue will do to net income, rate of return, and so on. So then we look at on a per line basis, what does this mean? So if we're losing USF support, and these are legitimate costs incurred, we still have costs that need to be recovered. So if we can't get it from USF, we're not getting it from inter-carrier compensation, where do we get it? Well, presumably from our end user customers, if anyone. So this is just a view of how much we would need to raise local rates to recover those costs, recover those revenues that we're losing under this reform. So about $1.80 in 2012, jumps up to $4.63 in 2013, and then ratchets back a little bit in 2014. But we've already talked about raising local rates if they're too low today to meet that threshold. We've talked about raising the access recovery charge up to $3 per month. So, you talk maybe $5 there, and then add another $4 or $5 onto it. Not sure exactly how happy end user customers are going to be about paying an incremental $10 a month for phone service. Okay. So we then wanted to look just from an impacted company's perspective, because that's on an average. That's saying that, hey, average telephone company is hit by all of those. So I put a table together here that said, of the 65 companies, how many were hit by each of these different elements, and what does that mean for those companies? So I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, but I just wanted to give you a feel for, hey, if your company is getting safety net additive based on a reduction in loops over time, what can you expect that the impact might be on your company? The same thing for if you're impacted by these regression-based limitations on capital and operating expenditures, what might that impact look like on your company as well? And so again, we have a sample of 65 companies, and we look and see that approximately 20 or a third of those are impacted by those proposed regression-based caps. Go down to the bottom line here, and impacts on a per line per month basis is pretty stark for those companies that are impacted. Okay, we then shift over to inter-carrier compensation reform to look and see what the impacts there are. And in general, I'll sort of say that from an inter-carrier compensation perspective, I think the reaction within the industry has been sort of, okay, we think we can survive that. Really at the end of the day, it should be about a 5% annual reduction in revenues. Do we want to see a reduction of any kind? No. But if it's 5% a year, we can target what our revenue streams are going to be. We can budget to that, and we can work towards that number. And overall, the reaction in the industry seems to be much less concerned about inter-carrier compensation reform than it is about USF reform. And so we see that intrastate terminating rates are phasing down to interstate rates over the first 2 years, and then interstate terminating switched access rates start phasing down to 0 as well. So we see what the impact of that is. So by 2014, we're talking about a reduction of about $170,000 a year of revenue. But we're then also assessing those access recovery charges on end user customers. So over time, that generates about an $80,000 bump in revenues for average telephone company. We have Connect America funding that's calculated using that sort of complex calculation I said earlier. We start with that eligible recovery. We subtract out our inter-carrier compensation, we subtract out our access recovery charge revenues. What's left over comes from the Connect America Fund. And then the bottom line here, this interstate traffic sensitive settlement reduction is a combination of the elimination of local switching support and that 5% phase down of eligible recovery on an annual basis. So we get to the bottom line here for average telephone company, you see a positive number for 2012. You say, wait a second, how did I just win in this whole equation? How did I generate more revenues? Well, in all honesty, that's not real likely. That's sort of the nature of how we performed our analysis. We forecast our clients' costs out over a 9-year period. And so what we're seeing here is the result of companies that are forecasting their switched access revenue requirements to decline by more than 5%. So if my costs go down by more than 5%, but my cost recovery is only going down 5% a year, well, what happens? The difference between my cost and my cost recovery is the benefit or the potential benefit of incentive regulation. Now, we know that forecasting today out into the future is fairly difficult, so I'm not terribly confident in the fact that those companies are actually going to reduce their switched access revenue requirements, actual costs, by more than 5%. But that's what the analysis is telling us today based on the information we have. But, you know, we look out a little bit further into 2014 and we see that starting to level out. So again, from an inter-carrier compensation perspective, we don't want to see a 5% reduction in annual revenues, but when we look at companies' actual costs and the cost recovery being outlined, the picture doesn't look too bleak. It's really the USF side of the equation that really has us scratching our head and saying, how are we going to recover these revenue streams? So here are our financial statements on a simplified basis and what the overall impacts are on average telephone company. So I looked at this from two perspectives. I started with consolidated net income, which includes regulated and non-regulated operations, and then I looked at regulated only. So the first two columns are before reform. The right two columns are after reform. So we started with regulated revenue of $4.1 million, non-regulated revenue of $1 million, so on, our regulated, non-regulated expenses. So we had pre-tax income of $464,000. Income tax expense of $158,000, net income of $306,000 on a rate base of $5.3 million. We divide net income by rate base and come up with about a 6% rate of return. Not exactly where we want to be, but survivable. We then look at it from a regulated standpoint. Same revenues, same regulated expenses. We get rid of the non-regulated components. We have pre-tax income of $550,000. Income tax expense, net income of $363,000. Rate base of just shy of $5 million. That gives us a return on our investment of 7.25%. Again, not bad, survivable, we're okay with that. But sort of as I've talked about already, that return on our non-regulated operations may not be what the regulators think it is. I think a lot of the regulators perceive that those non-regulated operations are cash cows, and this would prove out that they really aren't. It actually is reducing our bottom line, not increasing our bottom line. So then we look at it from an adjusted perspective. We take out the impacts of the USF and inter-carrier compensation reform, and that reduces our pre-tax income to $309,000 from a regulated perspective. Calculate income taxes on that. We have net income of $200,000 on our same $5 million rate base or net investment, and our 7.25% rate of return is now 4.1%. Maybe not acceptable anymore. Pretty low level, and to be honest with you, the numbers tend to get a little bit worse as we go out over time. We're just looking at 2013, 2014 timeframe. We then roll that in with our consolidated, our non-regulated operations that aren't propping us up as some may believe they are, and our net income drops below $150,000 on a $5.3 million investment, so my annual return is less than 3%. So, we're talking about $250,000 reduction in our revenue streams. What does that mean to the bottom line? It can be pretty significant. And I know a lot of folks in this room come from cooperatives, so you're asking, well, what's this income tax expense line? So, apologize, there are certainly some in the room who are taxable, so I left that in there. So, some pretty significant impacts of this USF and intercarrier compensation reform on average telephone company. My guess is your company has done a similar analysis to this to figure out what are the short-term and long-term implications of this order on your company. Okay, a couple of quick slides about funding reform. How do we get cost recovery for the changes that are coming into play here? So we've got a $2 billion annual budget that we identified earlier, and that is the approximate size of the fund today. So we've got high-cost loop support, interstate common line support, local switching support, safety net additive, and safety valve. Those are all the things that go into making up that $2 billion today, which is designed to support the universal availability of voice services. And in most situations, seems to have been pretty successful in doing that. That fund has really helped us to meet that universal service principle for voice services across the nation. Now, what about the Connect America Fund? That's also a $2 billion fund. Well, it's still designed to support the voice network and the voice services we provide, but it also has to help recover intercarrier compensation reform, the reduction in switched access per minute of use rates. We saw that the residual at the bottom of that equation came out of the Connect America Fund. What's going to happen to originating switched access? Right now, it's just terminating switched access. But in the further notice, the FCC says we know that bill and keep is the end game, and asks the question, does originating access need to be supported? Meaning, do we have to have universal service funding have support for that cost recovery? And then what about broadband? The order says in order to be eligible for universal service funding, we have to provide broadband at certain standards. Well, there's a cost of meeting those standards. There's a cost of providing broadband at 4x1. And so where is that cost recovery going to come from for those incremental costs? Well, it's going to come out of the Connect America Fund. And there's a lot of cost of getting to, or could be a lot of cost of getting to 4x1. I've talked to a lot of my clients, and some sort of wave it off and say, it's easy, I'm already there, not a problem. I'm there for 95% of my customers, and it wouldn't be too difficult to get to the other 5%. And there are others that have said, we don't know how we're going to get there. We're nowhere close. We may have 4x1 for a third of our customers, but the rest of our customers are at data rates substantially lower than that. So we'll have a significant incremental cost to get from today's current levels to those required standards. So point being is, we have a $2 billion fund. Sort of look at this as filling up a water balloon with a fire hose. We've got a lot of cost recovery flowing through that fire hose into the Connect America Fund water balloon. As we shove more cost recovery into that balloon, at some point it's going to pop. $2 billion, in my opinion, probably isn't going to be enough. So it's a tough question as to how do we do all of these things under a fixed fund. I think I just talked through my next slide without but how do we actually do that? How is the FCC going to say, okay, we have a $2 billion fund, we're not going above that threshold. How do we get there? Well, some of the things that they're looking at doing, or may need to do to accomplish that, is this regression analysis that's limiting capital and operating expenditures. They're going to have to limit the amount of cost that flows into the calculation of support. They've already applied corporate operations expense limitations to to high-cost loop support. We carried that forward to interstate common line support. That's going to reduce the amount of support available. Reduce the support factors. Today, for high-cost loop support, we get 65% cost recovery for our actual costs above a certain threshold, 75% cost recovery for our actual costs above an even greater threshold. So if they reduce those cost recovery factors, that'll reduce the amount of high-cost loop support we receive. Again, these are artificial ways of saying, hey, your costs don't go away, but we're just giving you less cost recovery for those costs that you legitimately incur to keep under this cap. Another approach could be rate of return, what they call re-prescription. That's basically just setting the rate of return at a different level. It's 11.25% today for interstate rate of return. They brought that down to 8 or 9%. The requirements from universal service funding would be substantially less, because that's the return you get on your net investment, part of the calculation of how much support you receive. Okay, so now we finally get to the good stuff. Just checking the time here. Okay, I think we're good on time, and we'll leave concerns for questions at the end as well. So what are some business opportunities and best practices that hopefully you can implement at your company to try to address this? What are different ways of generating more revenue or reducing costs? Okay, well, this certainly isn't a sound strategy of hiding your head in the sand and saying it's all going to go away. You know, we've filed a lot of comments with the FCC. We've told them what we think is right and wrong with their order and what they should do with this further notice. But, you know, hopefully they're going to make some changes to it. But I don't think we can put our heads in the sand and believe that they're going to buy into everything we're saying and make all the changes we want them to make. We're going to have to live under the constraints that they've identified, so we've got to figure out how to do it. Now, this probably isn't the best answer either. Yeah, no sense jumping off the building, stepping off the ledge. Let's figure out how to, you know, strategically plan to get to where we need to be to use what the FCC has done to us here. Okay, so I want to talk through some opportunities and best practices and really focus in on 4 primary principles here that I'd like you to consider. First is that planning is more critical than ever. As an industry, and I know you got to look in the mirror and please be honest with yourselves here, as an industry, we probably haven't done the best job historically of budgeting and planning and benchmarking and testing how well we've done to those budgets and standards we set for ourselves. Under rate of return regulation, it said, you go build the network, you spend what you need to, and we're going to give you cost recovery for it. So did it matter what I set my budget to be? Well, in some respects, no, because if I exceeded that budget, I was going to get incremental cost recovery for those costs that were above my budgeted budget. And so I didn't have a lot of incentive to do a real detailed budget plan and stick to it, because I'd still get at least some cost recovery for those costs. Cost efficiency. You know, we're going to have to get used to, as an industry, looking for ways to reduce our costs. You know, what ways can we be more efficient? How can we work together? How do we eliminate expenses that we incur today that may not be 100% necessary, but are nice conveniences to have? We need to get creative and competitive. Again, this hasn't been a strong suit in the industry. You know, we've sort of operated under the premise of, you know, what color would you like your telephone to be so long as it's black or white? We haven't been big marketing engines out there. We haven't really had to sell our services. Customers always needed and wanted the services we had to offer, and they had to come to us to get them. And so we didn't worry too much about marketing and sales. But we're going to have to get a whole lot better at marketing ourselves and selling our services and being creative to offer the services and the bundles and the packages that customers want. And finally, become a strong broadband provider. That's what the future is all about, is having the best broadband pipe available to those end user customers. They may not get their content from us over time, but we want the connection to the end user customer to come through the traditional telephone company. We want to have the best DSL or the best fiber to the home or whatever the delivery mechanism is that will provide the pipe that the customers need to get the content Okay, so from a strategic management planning standpoint, I want to focus in on a couple of areas here. First is to develop a few core strategies. I've seen a lot of business plans over time that fail because they take a shotgun approach. They have 100 different things that they'd like to accomplish in the next year or the next couple of years. And we all know that that's very difficult to do. We're much better with a very targeted approach of what are the 1, 2, 3 things that will make us most successful, that can have the greatest impact on our business. So be very targeted, develop a few core strategies of what you want to accomplish. Keep it simple. Don't try to solve world hunger. Try to address the things that can make your business more successful. What is it that your customers want? How do we get there? So your plans have to be in alignment. We start at the top with your strategic corporate plan. We then go down to departmental plans. So we've got a corporate plan this is where we want to get to in these key areas. The departmental plan, so within our plant operations, within our accounting department, within our marketing division, how do their goals align to reaching those overarching corporate plans? And then we also need to tie that in from a financial perspective to our annual budget. Do we have the budget in place to allow us to accomplish those goals? Have we targeted our finances to what it is that our strategic goals are saying? Measure your results. We can't just say here's what we're going to do and then step back and at the end of the year guess and see if we got there. We've got to financially measure those results. We've got to implement some metrics and really encourage folks to do some benchmarking. Benchmark against your own history. Benchmark against others in the industry. Make sure that you are being as efficient as possible. Make sure that your cost structure measures up well with others. And without a structure, you won't have a good result. Remember early in my career, one of my mentors told me that let me see if I can say this right. It was so ingrained in my thought process that I can't even get it out exactly. But basically what he told me is that a poor plan, well implemented, will be a great plan, poorly implemented any day of the week. So make sure, put the plan together, get a couple of key strategies you want, and then focus on it. Really drive through those goals. Measure your results and analyze what you did at the end of each year, reestablish what those goals are, and move forward. From a network perspective, looking at cost efficiency, is there a way to future-proof or make a very efficient network? I'm not a technical guy, so I don't know the answers to this, but people tell me that, hey, the more fiber I deploy, the less maintenance I have to do. The more old copper I have, the more maintenance is required. And so to the extent that you can identify areas where old copper can be replaced and reduce maintenance expenses, would encourage you to do that. Look at some ways of sharing resources with other companies, or taking existing resources, existing assets you have, and sharing them with others. And by sharing, I don't mean giving. I mean paying for or getting payment for what you have. So look at, do we have fiber capacity? Are there others out there that could utilize that fiber capacity, and what's it worth to them? Could be a new revenue stream for you. Switching agreements. This is an area where I think that a lot of companies are going to start heading in this direction of, as opposed to replacing the switches they have, putting in a centralized switch for multiple companies. We saw that switched access revenue requirement and revenue stream is frozen at its 2011 levels and going to decrease by 5%. Well, what happens if I have to go buy a new switch? Well, my actual costs are going to increase relative to what my cost recovery is. So if I need a new switch, maybe there are 3 other companies in the neighborhood who need a new switch as well. Can we put in a centralized switch and share those resources and reduce my actual costs? Collapse multiple networks. If you've got multiple networks, multiple systems out there performing similar functions, bring them together as possible. Here's an interesting one that I know is, I think there's another session going on today about this exact issue. Mergers, combinations, and joint operations. How can I better work with the neighboring companies to, are we better off as a much larger organization, combining ourselves together and reducing our costs that way? Efficiencies through greater scale. Joint operations. We're seeing more and more companies look at how do we maybe bring together the accounting functions or the customer service and marketing functions of multiple companies and sharing those resources, putting them in a separate organization and basically splitting up the cost of those. What many companies are finding is if there are 3 neighboring companies that each have 4 accountants, that's a total of 12. That's what they need to run their own operations. But if they put all of those accounting functions into one organization, they're finding that maybe we only need 10 accountants to do the work of those 12 because they're able to fill in those gaps for free time in those schedules with work from other companies. So some cost efficiencies that may be had there. From a capital expenditure standpoint, look at critical and targeted capital budgeting. We can't anymore invest to keep our rate base up. Historically, we've said, well, we've got to invest to keep our rate base at a consistent level because it's rate base times rate of return that generates my profit. Well, at least in certain areas, from a switched access perspective, that's no longer the case. The revenue streams you receive are not going to be tied to your investment plan. They're tied to what you had in place in 2011. And so look at areas that will actually drive additional revenues from customers or from end users. We've got to make a business case for non-regulated activities. I think historically, a lot of us said, this looks like a fun thing to get into, but a good business to be in, and there wasn't necessarily a business case behind it. More and more, we're going to have to look at those non-regulated operations and say, do they fit in with our core business, and are they financially sound? Are they providing something to the bottom line? And if they're not generating a positive bottom line, are they supporting another service that is? Is it necessary to have that non-regulated service in order to provide or in order to support some of the regulated services we're offering? So, there may be situations where we pursue break-even opportunities, but we've really got to look at where our revenues are driven, where our net income comes from, and if we have a negative bottom line on those non-regulated services, we maybe have to look at jettisoning those. Implement a project management process and making sure that you're keeping up on what those projects are. You have limited capital dollars to expend, so you want to make sure you do it right. You want to make sure that you keep the costs as budgeted. And so putting a project management process in place will allow you to eliminate any creep in the scope and increases in costs. Tightening inventory controls. In a lot of situations, we've had the incentive to, hey, we can have a lot of inventory on hand because we're going to get cost recovery for that inventory. Now, we may want to look at potentially sharing inventory with others or just reduce the amount of inventory we have on hand, go to more of a just-in-time inventory process so that we don't have that cash tied up in inventory sitting out in the cable yard or in the warehouse. From an operating expenditure standpoint, some tough decisions to be made here, some tough processes to think through. First is challenge your current and future headcount. Do you need all of the people that you have? I know that's a painful thing to go through, especially, well, I shouldn't say especially in a cooperative environment. In any rural environment, the employees are your friends, they're your neighbors, they're your family. And so you're providing an important economic driver for the community by employing those folks. But at the end of the day, you have to be fiscally responsible for the members of the telephone company. So we've got to look at the best way of doing this is attrition without replacement. When people retire, we have to decide, do we really need to replace them, or can we take their functions and assign them to others that are already within the organization? Look at targeted reductions. Where are people not performing well? Where do we have inefficiencies in our staffing? Do we have people who have a lot of idle time? If so, could we eliminate one of those positions and share their workload amongst others when they have some free time as well. And really, those targeted reductions should be accomplished through a robust performance management process, where you're not just out of the blue saying, sorry, we don't have enough work for you, we got to get rid of someone. You've got to look at your people and determine who is performing well, and get those high performers in the right places, and get the low performers out of the organization. Evaluate productivity and efficiency. As the number of customers that you serve declines, and that's been happening throughout the industry, as those numbers decline, is there less cost in the business? Certainly less revenue in the business, so we have to figure out what that means. Outsourcing. Analyzing how many full-time employees we have. A primary example of this is construction crews. There's still a lot of companies out there that have their own construction crews that are full-time employees that may not be fully utilized. So encourage those companies to look at two different alternatives. One, generate additional revenues out of that construction crew. Turn them into an economic resource for the company by offering your services to a neighboring telephone company. Become their contract. Generate revenues as opposed to just building your own network. The other alternative would be to eliminate your construction crew and look at outsourcing to contractors. Because you may not be doing as much construction going forward as you historically have, and if so, do you need to have a construction crew on staff full time? Benefit packages. This is one that I know has been hit hard by regulators. I'm in California and I do a fair amount of work with California companies. The regulators there have hit very hard on the benefits that are being offered by the rural telcos. In general, what we need to do is we need to look at what competing industries are offering in terms of benefits for similar employees. Typically, rural carriers have offered a pretty rich benefit plan to their employees. And we've got to determine going forward, does that make sense? In many cases, rural telcos are still paying 100% of the cost of those benefits for employees. I know that when you get into a lot of other sectors of the telecom industry or other industries, you'll find that employees are always required to contribute 20, 25%, sometimes more to the cost of their health benefits and so on. So maybe some fundamental changes that need to be made there in terms of the benefit packages. Some other options here, consolidation or elimination of subsidiaries that are driving operating expenses through employees, through audits, through whatever the cost driver may be. Already mentioned this before, cost sharing. Merge or partner with others. Share the cost of functions that are common between those organizations. One that I know a lot of companies have been looking at is accounting and finance. Is there some way of bringing those departments together for multiple companies and reducing the overall cost? This is a tough one for me to say out loud in front of such a big group and many clients in the room, but we all have to look at this as ways of tightening our belt. And so, as a vendor to the industry, as a consultant to the industry, I understand that tough times are ahead, and you should as well, and you should take that opportunity to say, hey, we're all going to have to tighten our belts a little bit here, including the vendors that provide services to the industry. So we've got to realize that it's not the same as it used to be, and we've got to change the way we do business. From sales and marketing perspective, just a couple of thoughts here. First, make sales and revenue replacement a priority. Again, sales and marketing is something we probably haven't been known for as an industry over time, but we've got to make it our core focus going forward. We've got to have people within the organization that are responsible for sales and marketing. We have to measure their performance, measure their results, and hold them accountable to those performances. We want to use a commission structure to reward behavior if possible. Anytime you're in a sales environment, what drives those salespeople is every time they make a sale, they get more revenue. If they're not out there being successful making sales, well, then their revenue, their income is going to be at risk. We want to make sure that we have a prospect pipeline and data mining to make sure with our customers. Why are people leaving? If we see customers leaving our services, we need to call and try to win them back. There's a lot of providers out there, cable TV and other industries, that when someone terminates service, a manager is then on the phone with those individuals trying to get them back. What is it that you don't like about us? What did we do wrong? How do we win your business back? We need to do that as a telco as well. Bundling is going to be more and more important going forward. We've got to have bundles of services that meet customer needs. What are their requirements? What is it that they want from us? We've got to create bundles that meet those needs and deliver the services they want. Look for some creative new sales channels. What are the best ways of getting our services out there? What are the best ways of getting customers to understand what we have to offer them? And we have a lot of great ways of doing that. I've been hearing more and more that our best salespeople are the install and repair technicians that go out there. They're on the front lines. They're the ones who are seeing and hearing the customers, hearing their frustrations about what doesn't work, driving around in the truck with the telephone company sign on the side and people stopping and saying, hey, what about this new service? So we've got to make those employees part of our sales channel as well. Need to look for opportunities to diversify our revenue streams. And I'll talk about a few of those opportunities here momentarily. Study those financial and technical viability of those options and only do those things that make financial sense. Okay, so when we look at some innovation from a sales and services standpoint, I don't have all the answers. As a matter of fact, I probably don't have that many answers, but I do have a few thoughts, and I have talked to a fair number of people out there in the industry and gotten a feel for what people are trying to do. So some different things that folks are looking at is IPTV and cable television. It's customer and competition driven, so it can be a very difficult business. But it drives the broadband requirements. It gets a robust broadband network out there. We can offer local content as a differentiator from other providers. Typically, as the telco, you're going to be the local provider of cable television, so you'll have access or more drive to provide local content, and that may be a differentiator in the market. It is capital marketing and content intensive. So pretty much everyone I've talked to has said that cable TV or IPTV is a break even at best. You may lose money doing it. So need to study the financial aspects of it to make sure that it makes sense for you. Over-the-top video is sort of the next phase of that content delivery that we've been seeing that may, in all honesty, be a replacement for IPTV or cable TV in the future. So I think you need to take that into account when you're looking at IPTV or cable as a business opportunity. There's not a lot of incremental revenue that we see from over-the-top video. We've seen companies who are basically partnering with equipment providers. They're selling the equipment, getting sort of a residual on that. But in terms of incremental monthly revenues, we don't see a whole lot there. But it may drive broadband usage. People using that over-the-top video, that's going to be a big driver of how much broadband capacity they need. So if you sell a customer on over-the-top video, they may be coming back to you and saying, hey, upgrade me from 4 megs to 10 megs, or 10 megs to 20 megs, or so on. Alarm and monitoring services. We've been talking to a few clients about how do we get into the alarm and monitoring business. Utilizes the existing loop, potentially requires broadband services. The investment is incremental. So every time I sign up a new customer, and I know I'm going to have incremental revenues, that's when I incur additional costs. And typically we can provide those services with existing or outsourced staff, so no incremental operating expenditures either. Smart home services, another evolving market, driving broadband usage, driving usage of the network, and we're going to generate some revenues, typically not recurring revenues, but one-time revenues off the sale and installation of the equipment necessary. Some wireless opportunities that are out there. Probably have heard about some 4G or long-term equivalent opportunities, partnership opportunities with large national carriers or rural associations or rural affiliations. Leasing tower space in building fiber to towers. It seems to be a big opportunity that's out there for wireless carriers. And still seeing some companies looking at sort of edging out their broadband network via a wireless ISP sort of backbone or structure. Outsource some existing resources. I mentioned this before. Do you have people on your staff? Do you have equipment that can be utilized by other neighboring companies or other businesses in the community? You know, some ideas here. Chief Information Officer or tech support, data center, customer service. Could you be a customer service center for other telcos in the area, other broadband providers, or maybe even completely other businesses that have nothing to do with telecommunications? Finance and accounting. Can you bring your organizations together with others? Talk about the construction crew, or maybe your construction equipment. Could you lease that out to someone else who doesn't want to buy new tractors, but may be willing to lease your tractors on a per usage basis? Okay, so I know I moved through that last section sort of quickly, but I wanted to make sure to leave a few extra minutes for questions. We're actually right at 11:30, but I would like to open it up for questions. If there are any, I'd be happy to answer them here. If you can raise your hand, I'll try to come get the question and repeat it. So do we have any questions from the audience? What happens when we run right up against lunch? Everyone wants to run out the door. Well, if there are no questions, thank you all very much. Hopefully you enjoyed the conference.